Queen Victoria, the Queen Empress. Her 64-year reign was one of perpetual dynastic expansion as she spread the influence of her kin into nearly all the palaces of Europe. When she died in 1901, Victoria left an extended family network that spanned 9 European thrones. From London to Berlin, Oslo to Madrid, Victoria's offspring and their spouses were at the very top of high society. And they called themselves the Club.
There are the people, there is the aristocracy, which is slightly more important than the people, and there are the royals, who are different.
But despite the pomp and the privilege, Victoria's dynasty was not fit for purpose. This extended royal family would lurch from crisis to crisis. With these 3 men in the eye of the storm, they were first cousins who together ruled over half the earth. They were Prince George, later to become King George V of England, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and Kaiser William II of Germany. Long-forgotten royal correspondence has come to light, revealing the real truth of their relationship at a time when monarchy was teetering at its height.
My dearest Nicky, I saw William at Coburg the other day, and he seemed...
My dear Georgie, I am sorry I did not answer you directly. We have lived through very anxious and difficult moments.
You say to Georgie at last being married. Now all the members of the club are married.
But these powerful kings sat on precarious thrones. With Queen Victoria's death, broken promises and betrayal would tear this royal club apart, putting the institution of monarchy itself in grave peril. Now, previously unseen intelligence documents reveal the British King, George V, torn between duty to his throne, his country, and his family. Over the years, fragments of royal correspondence have come to light. But now, the Russian state archives have yielded more secrets. Historian Andrew Cook believes he has found the crucial missing pieces in the hidden lives of 3 monarchs at war. And George's letters to his cousin Nicholas offer a rare insight into life at the heart of the club.
It's very much like looking over the shoulder of George as he's writing these letters.
My dear Nicky, May and I are sending you a book of Windsor Castle, which I thought would interest you. We had a good day shooting today and got 2,000 pheasants and 120... I'm sending you 2 boxes, which contain about 80,000 stamps. Ever your devoted cousin and friend, Georgie.
He's talking about the weather, he's talking about his family, he's talking about Nicholas's family, at the same time that he's talking about quite significant world events.
But there was trouble at the heart of the club. George's letters to Tsar Nicholas reveal his true feelings towards the 3rd cousin, Queen Victoria's eldest grandson, Kaiser William, Emperor of Germany.
My dearest Nicky, I saw William at Coburg the other day, and he seemed more excitable than ever. He hardly spoke to me at all, which was a good thing.
William fitted very neatly into that classic Edwardian character type the club bore. He was a man who was constantly animated with new enthusiasms, motor cars, yachts, ships, you name it, and he loved to pin someone in the corner and to share his enthusiasms with them.
Behind William's back, George and Nicholas shared their lack of enthusiasm for their difficult cousin.
My dear Nicky, now Papa is sending me for William's birthday. Rather a bore. But I shall be there a very short time.
He's the kind of person that you dread sitting next to on a transatlantic flight.
He was a man of indescribable arrogance and vanity.
The consensus within the family was dodge William if you possibly can at big gatherings.
My dear old Nicky, How did you get on with William when you met him this summer?
Inevitably, club gatherings were state occasions, and Kaiser William was a wild card.
William, it has to be said, was fantastically indiscreet. We know that King Ferdinand of Bulgaria left Berlin white-hot with rage because William had made so bold as to smack him on the bottom in public. In 1904, he playfully broke a field marshal's baton over the shoulders of Grand Duke Vladimir of Russia, and so on. So he was someone who was given to effusive, tactless acts, which often offended people.
As a young child, William had been obsessed with boats. Now, an emperor of a vigorous industrial nation, William had the chance to build a mighty German navy, one in the eye of his British relatives.
This new generation of ships, this is a kind of weapon that has never been built before. It involves the latest technology. These are huge and immensely prestigious objects, and they cost immense fortunes to build.
William threw everything he had into an arms race, and at the same time claimed nothing had changed between him and his British cousins. Only he chose to do it in an interview with the Daily Telegraph.
He says, for example, of course I'm not anti-British. Yes, most Germans are anti-British, but I'm not. I love Britain. I love your country. I'm the best friend you have in the world, and I don't understand why I've been misunderstood and why I'm so vilified by your press. The British just laughed. They thought it was hilarious.
But William, the club bore, didn't get the joke.
He looked down on both George and Nicholas. He saw George as a hopeless homebody who didn't travel enough, who knew no foreign languages, of Nicholas II of Russia. He famously said he was perhaps good for growing turnips and living in a country house, but not for much else.
Whilst Queen Victoria's very presence had kept these family feuds in check, the new British king, Edward VII, preferred the high life to club politics, much to William's disgust.
William had profound contempt for his uncle Bertie. He thought that he was self-indulgent, which he certainly was. He thought he was stupid, which he certainly wasn't. And even more important, perhaps, he thought that he did not really count as a king. He was only a king while William was an emperor.
But time was running out for this royal dynasty, riven with jealousy, rivalry, and the might of empires.
His history proved only too bitterly that a royal alliance was no guarantee of a political alliance.
Britain and Germany were gearing up for all-out war. At the dawn of the 20th century, 9 European thrones were related through Queen Victoria. Intimate letters reveal the hidden lives of the 3 cousins at the centre of her royal club: George, William, and Nicholas.
My dear Nicky, I look upon you, if I may do so, as one of my oldest and best friends, Georgie.
But as Britain edged closer to war with Germany, and whilst the Russian people starved, the monarchs played on.
My dearest Nicky, I hope that you have enjoyed your cruise in the yacht. You seem to be having a very boisterous season, with no end of balls and parties. I'm afraid you get but little rest. Ever your devoted cousin and friend, Georgie.
On the 2nd of August 1909, Georgie's cousin and friend, Tsar Nicholas, arrived in England with his family for the Cowes Regatta. The whole family, children included, had travelled in their royal yacht, the Standard. Its bow was covered in gold leaf, and it was thought to be the most luxurious yacht afloat.
The Russian Tsar was, of course, a wealthy man, and it was a completely different world. Sometimes it was more than the wildest fantasies of Hollywood would go.
There were journalists everywhere, they were filmed, there were newsreels about the fleet reviews. There were also these regattas and yacht races.
The lifestyle was absolutely enviable, elegant inertia, sometimes signing a few documents in between, and they would meet for these tremendous royal parties.
It was a whirl of social events. The new British King, Edward VII, and his son, the future King George V, entertained the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia. A family portrait taken at the time shows two families enjoying their holiday. The youngest of the Tsar's children, Tsarevich Alexei, sits with his sister Anastasia at the feet of their Uncle Edward. Olga and Tatiana stand behind Uncle Georgy, who keeps a reassuring arm around his niece, Marie. Everyone loved the fact that, dressed in matching uniforms, George and Nicholas looked almost the same man.
My dear Nicky, I must send you a line to thank you for the Russian Admiral's uniform which you have so kindly sent me, and I wish to tell you again how proud I am to be an Admiral in your Navy.
As they both loved uniforms, loved dressing up. They could confuse their own family. And in St. Petersburg, George was known as the Tsar's honorary brother.
Dressing up in uniforms and regalia was part and parcel of being a monarch.
The crowned heads of Europe attached absurdly exaggerated importance to the whole array of honours and titles and decorations and medals. And what feels perhaps almost that if suddenly all the titles, honours and decorations were stripped away, there'd be nothing there.
And George and Nicholas were not alone in their passion. Kaiser William loved nothing better than showering himself with military honours.
Even by those standards, William struck virtually all his contemporaries as a uniform freak, a uniform obsessive. He changed uniforms for public occasions, sometimes a dozen times in one day. He took all this terribly seriously.
Whilst cousin William was busy parading around Germany, Nicholas and George spent 4 days together at Cowes, enjoying cucumber sandwiches and croquet on the lawn. It seemed swapping uniforms and messing about in boats really could bring nations together. But back in Russia, behind the showy pomp and grandeur, Nicholas' sprawling empire was falling apart. His people starved, and the streets ran with fear and violence.
My dearest Nicky, I'm so sorry to see the students have again been kicking up a row in the different universities, as I know it must be all a great worry to you. Georgie.
But whilst Russia starved, Nicholas went hunting.
Dear Georgie, 100 deer, 56 goats, 50 boar, 10 foxes, 27 hares, 243 in 11 days. Ever yours, Nicky.
Nicholas was a tragic figure. He was a man of limited intelligence. He was politically inept. He was limited in vision. He made awful blunders. He was, I'm afraid, as a leader, as a head of one of the great countries of Europe, an unmitigated disaster.
To make matters worse, Nicholas did what few other monarchs did. He listened to his wife, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, Princess Alexandra. But even worse to Russian eyes, Alexandra was German.
But she would always deny this and say, I am English, I am not German. But there was something very unbending about her and unappealing, and she did the Tsar no good in Russia at all.
Strong-willed and domineering, Alexandra took it upon herself to advise the Tsar. When protesters gathered in St. Petersburg in January 1905, she was by his side when Nicholas, as usual, dithered over what to do.
And his advisors said, Sir, you must come into the Winter Palace. You must talk to these people, to the leaders of this demonstration. And Alex said, don't you dare. Don't ever, ever capitulate to a mob. And he listened and he obeyed.
The result was a massacre that became known as Bloody Sunday.
When there was blood on the cobblestones outside the Winter Palace, he said, I think I shall take up dominoes in my spare time.
He was so blinkered, he was so extraordinarily short-sighted, but even to his sort of bemused and shuttered mind, I think flickers must have come through, suggesting that disaster was not very far away.
Whilst Russia suffered under Nicholas, Britain basked in the reign of popular aging playboy King Edward VII. But in May 1910, Edward died. Nicholas' cousin Georgie would now be king.
The death of Edward VII is obviously a very momentous moment in George's life, a very sad and devastating moment for him. Edward was his mentor. In many ways, they worked very, very closely together from the moment that Edward came to the throne.
My dearest Nicky, these last 3 weeks have been terrible. My heart has been nearly breaking. At the same time, I have had to entertain William, 7 kings, and numerous princes and representatives from practically all the countries of the world. Georgie.
In front of the world's press, George led a funeral procession which was to go down in history as the Parade of Kings. Up front, the club's Premier League paraded in their best uniforms. Merely elected heads of state, such as American President Theodore Roosevelt, were left to trail behind. But not everyone in line was that upset.
William responded to the news of Edward VII's death with a sense of deep relief. It's no exaggeration to say that he loathed Edward VII. He loathed and feared him, he envied him, he was also obsessed with him. And I think his feeling when Edward VII died was relief, but also perhaps the hope that the relationship within the family, the relationship with his English relatives might now be healed, that there might be a sort of growing together again. And that, I think, is what this great funeral in 1910 is all about.
In public, all seemed well between King George and his cousin Kaiser William. On May the 17th, 1911, outside Buckingham Palace, together they unveiled a memorial statue in honour of their grandmother, Queen Victoria.
It is a source of deep satisfaction to me that my dear cousin, the German Emperor, is present at this ceremony. His Imperial Majesty is the eldest grandson of Queen Victoria.
King George pulled a lever, and the curtains fell away. The colossal figure of the great Queen was revealed.
As time passes on and years unfold, events are revealed in their true character and proportion. We are sure that the tribute we are paying today will not be disputed by posterity. No woman was ever held in higher honor. No queen was ever loved so well.
Well-trained subjects let out a hearty cheer, and it seemed a good idea to let the guns thunder their salute in the monarch's honor. But the next time the big guns fired, Britain would be at war. And when war broke out, the battle lines were drawn along family friendships. George and Nicholas versus their cousin, William.
Yes, dearest Nicky. I hope we shall always continue our old friendship to one another. You know I never change, and have always been very fond of you. God bless you, my dear old Nicky. And remember, you can always count on me as your friend. Ever your devoted friend, Georgie.
A walking disaster in peacetime, Nicholas delivered little good news in war. As an ally against the German-led Central Powers, Nicholas' unwieldy Russian forces were of little use. Faced with a collapsing Eastern Front, George used every device to try and keep Nicholas and his army on side.
My dearest Nicky, I present you with the baton of a Field Marshal of my army. My army greatly appreciates you having become one of its chiefs.
After all their years of friendship, and still George didn't grasp quite how inept his cousin really was.
He had got this vast, totally incompetent rabble of a Russian army. The tragedy was that he fiddled while Russia burned, until finally, in the calamity of the First World War, it became clear that his power was real, but he was commanding nothing.
My dear Nicky, I am sending you the GCB, my highest military order, to hand to you as Commander-in-Chief of your splendid army, Georgie.
But Field Marshal Nicholas' splendid army was now in tatters.
Strikes are breaking out. You've got more and more people deserting from the front line. The army is hemorrhaging men. They're essentially giving up, walking in the opposite direction, going back home, and in many cases, in increasing numbers, actually joining the strikers.
Over on the Western Front, things were also looking bleak for George. It seemed that their cousin Kaiser William, the club Boer, might actually win the war.
A silly German sausage thought Napoleon he'd be, then went and broke his promise, it was made in Germany. He shook hands with Britannia and eternal peace he swore. Naughty boy, he talked of peace while he prepared for war.
After 1914, William II became the poster boy for German evil in British wartime propaganda. He's depicted strutting ape-like before burning libraries, crouching over raped and murdered women, celebrating the kind of ghastly atrocities associated in particular with the opening of the war in Belgium.
Belgium put the kibosh on the Kaiser.
My dear Nicky, England has made up her mind to fight this awful war out to an end, whatever our sacrifices may be. Our very existence is at stake.
As the bodies piled up, newspapers reported Dachshunds being kicked off pavements, whilst shops with German names had their windows smashed. Cousin Kaiser William, Queen Victoria's eldest grandson, was relentlessly lampooned in the press and the music hall. In Russia, Nicholas had lost control of both the war and his country. As Germany crushed his army, Nicholas desperately erased all links with the enemy. But whilst he could change the name of his capital, St. Petersburg, to the more Russian-sounding Petrograd, he couldn't change his wife. Tsarina Alexandra was denounced as a German spy. Crisis boiled over into revolution, and Tsar Nicholas, best friend and cousin of King George V of England, was forced to abdicate. Stripped of his throne, Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest. They desperately needed a friendly country to take them in. Historian Andrew Cook has been studying letters which reveal the hidden lives of three cousins and monarchs during their descent into war.
When the spring comes, we must attack the enemy with all our strength at the same time. And I feel sure that he will not be able to resist for long. Your ever most devoted cousin and friend, Georgie.
Now, Cook has also discovered recently declassified Foreign Office telegrams and Secret Service records detailing the tragic story of how the Russian imperial family, the Romanovs, tried to seek shelter in Britain. Being best friends with the King of England, this should have been a done deal. At least Tsar Nicholas thought so.
I think there was always an assumption that, yes, the Romanovs would be allowed into Britain, given a country house, perhaps not in London, somewhere out of the way where they could be ignored.
He instructed the few servants he had left to pack his ceremonial uniforms. He obviously thought when he got to England, nothing would have changed. He would still be Emperor of all the Russias, appearing at great military parades.
On the 22nd of March 1917, a meeting was convened between the British Prime Minister Lloyd George and King George's private secretary, Lord Stamfordham. The decision was made that Britain would indeed offer the Tsar asylum. The good news went at once to the provisional Russian government holding the Tsar and his family. Meanwhile, the Tsar's remaining household servants packed the imperial family's belongings. They fully expected a call at any moment to head for the port of Petrograd and board a ship to England. But the Tsar's children caught measles and were under doctor's orders not to travel. 1 week passed, and at last, on the 30th of March, King George summoned his private secretary Stamfordham and dictated a letter to the Foreign Office. It seemed George was finally about to issue the command to bring his cousins home.
As you are doubtless aware, the King has a strong personal friendship for the Emperor, and therefore would be glad to do anything to help him in this crisis. But His Majesty cannot help doubting whether it is advisable that the imperial family should take up residence in this country.
This past week, the King had obviously been doing some hard thinking.
George is obviously just getting incredibly nervous about the possibility of revolution being exported to Britain. Of course, there is some reason for this. Of course, Karl Marx had always written off Russia as a centre for revolution because Russia had not reached the capitalist stage. When he wrote his revolutionary books in the 19th century, he wrote them in Britain, was expecting it would be an industrial power like Britain which would have the first anti-capitalist revolution. So perhaps George V, although let's assume not too acquainted with Marx's works, is still worried that this will, light the tinderbox of revolution, and off we go.
As George's doubts grew, he left it to Stamfordham to voice his concerns.
He said to someone, the trouble is, we don't have a royal house to spare. We've only got Balmoral, and that's far too cold. Well, to say that to a Russian who's used to Siberian winters is delightful.
Prime Minister Lloyd George was surprised by this list of rather embarrassing excuses. After all, they had all agreed to invite the Tsar to England, and they trusted that King George would leave the matter at that. George and Nicholas were cousins, after all. But 7 days later, it would become clear to all that everything had changed. Friday, the 6th of April 1917, King George was residing in his favourite residence, Windsor Castle. On the face of it, just another routine royal day.
His day always started at 6:45, whatever happened. And on the dot of 9, as the chimes for Big Ben were striking, it was always at that precise moment he would walk into the dining room for breakfast with Queen Mary.
George spent most of the morning poring over his stamp collection. But he was more than usually agitated, and he sent for his private secretary. He told Stamfordham to write to the Foreign Office once again. Over in Petrograd, everybody was ready to move at a moment's notice. With belongings and uniforms packed, they could be on a ship within 4 hours. They were in little doubt as to where they'd be headed.
And even the children thought they were going to England. They got terribly excited. It was natural, absolutely natural to expect they would stay at Windsor with Cousin Georgie.
Meanwhile, George's latest message was being sent by royal messenger from Windsor Castle to the Foreign Office.
Every day, the King is becoming more concerned. The matter is being discussed, not only in clubs, but by working men. From the first, the King has thought the presence of the imperial family in this country would raise all sorts of difficulties, and I feel sure that you appreciate how awkward it will be.
It was now painfully apparent that the King had major issues with the offer of asylum. But as the Foreign Secretary read and reread the letter, little did he know that over in Windsor Castle, King George was already pacing his study, dictating a second tirade.
George V was a very stubborn man. He's someone also prone to enormous rages too. He was someone who light tradition. When he'd come to a point of view, he stuck by it. He's someone rather like his own stamp collection. He's someone who, when it's pinned down, he wanted to stay with that.
The arrival of this second letter from the king laid it on the line.
I think having changed his mind completely about the Romanovs, he was adamant that his worries should be communicated to the government and that the government should follow suit.
The king must beg you to represent to the Prime Minister that the opposition to the Emperor and Empress coming here is so strong that we must be allowed to withdraw.
The asylum issue develops to such a point that it becomes evident to Lloyd George that the king has reached a stage now where there's no way he's going to back down or change his mind.
It was a far cry from the expressions of deepest affection contained in George's 25 years of correspondence with his cousin.
Yes, dearest Nicky. I hope we shall always continue our old friendship to one. You know I never change, and have always been very fond of you. God bless you, my dear old Nicky. And remember, ever your devoted friend, Georgie.
After a cabinet meeting on the 13th of April, the offer of asylum was officially withdrawn. George seemed to have firmly shut the door on his cousin coming to England.
George V's U-turn, I think, is one of the most ignominious chapters in the history of the 20th century British monarchy. Britain had always been a traditional home for monarchs of whatever political hue. It's a very common thing for Britain to give them a little house somewhere in the country where they could take what was left of their court. In that context, refusing or indeed going back on the original promise to grant Nicholas II asylum in Britain is astonishing.
31st of July 1917. Nicholas and his family were moved without warning. They were taken to the town of Tobolsk, deep in Siberia. If George was to ever rescue his cousin, he'd have to act fast. But George had problems of his own. The most devastating war in history had brought Britain to its knees, and its grinding war of attrition had permeated the very fabric of British society. It even intruded into a private dinner party at Buckingham Palace.
And everything was going beautifully and talking about hunting and shooting and killing things and the weather. And Lady Maud Warrender, who was a chatterbox, and she artlessly sort of said to the king, "Oh, I believe, sir, that the rumour is going about that because of your name, you'll be pro-German." Of course, at this, the king nearly had a seizure. He went quite white, sat back in his chair, and left soon afterwards.
George's own family name, inherited from his grandfather, Prince Albert, was fast becoming a PR nightmare. The family surname, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was unavoidably very German.
We've had 3 years of German shops being smashed, people with German names being picked on. It's astonishing that the name change does not happen until 3 years into the war.
There are suggestions that they might want to re-adopt the old dynastic names, Plantagenet or Tudor or Stuart. Also other names like Fitzroy are mentioned. Even England as a name is mentioned.
But the perfect name was staring them right in the face.
It's George's favourite castle. It's very English sounding, and it really fits the bill in every respect.
As British as a cup of Earl Grey, the change of name was one in the eye for Cousin William and the German half of the club.
The Kaiser was fuming about this change of name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. And he said, "I shall be coming to England," he said, "to see a performance of the play The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha."
Whilst George was busy rebranding himself as a pure-bred Brit, a second wave of revolution broke in Russia.
I think that particularly once the Bolsheviks seized power in November of 1917, it becomes evident to all and sundry that the lives of the imperial family are now very much in danger.
If George was to save his cousin, he would have to act now. To make matters worse, Nicholas and his family were again moved to the industrial town of Ekaterinburg in the Bolshevik heartland. They were taken to a fortified compound known locally as the Ipatiev House. The Bolsheviks ominously renamed it the House of Special Purpose.
Well, by now they were very dispirited, run down, and Nicholas had always said they hate us in Siberia. He'd always had some uncanny instinct that this was going to be bad.
News reached King George. Could he really stand by again as his side of the club fell apart? Was it too late to rescue his cousin Nicholas? Maybe there was one last chance. Andrew Cook has discovered Secret Service records and recently declassified telegrams which reveal an audacious rescue plan Cook believes was instigated by King George. In 1918, Whitehall Court was the nerve centre of Britain's secret intelligence services. Head of this secret service was Sir Mansfield Cumming, known simply as C.
He had a very close personal relationship with George V. They'd both been, for example, naval cadets at Greenwich Naval College. We learn, for example, from George's diary that they enjoyed playing billiards together.
C set about creating a team of fluent Russian speakers and ordered a house to be constructed in the Russian port of Murmansk, then under British control. An Admiralty telegram sent in 1918 is explicit about its intended use.
A key quote in this telegram refers to the fact that this house was originally intended for use by the late Tsar. Why do you construct a house and equip it in Murmansk when the imperial family are in Siberia?
The Secret Service put their top agent into the field, Stephen Alley.
Stephen Alley was always known as the Alley spy. And there was a feeling in the family that when he was in Murmansk, he'd been involved in a mission which didn't quite come off, but nobody ever quite knew what it was, and there was always a mystery surrounding it. The rumour that grandfather had heard has now been proved to be true.
Alley's diaries and telegrams have never been studied before. Peppered with locations, dates and names, they reveal a previously unknown desperate rescue plan relying on a mysterious shipping agent called Armitstead.
He says, for example, "I have made it clear to Armitstead in no uncertain terms that his role is strictly liaison. We are responsible for securing and delivering valuables. He is responsible for their safe passage out of Russia." I think we can, again, draw from the terminology here that valuables is shorthand for the imperial family.
And now, after 70 years lying undiscovered amongst family belongings, Alley's personal notebook has come to light. It reveals how close he came to rescuing the Tsar and his family, even going so far as to scout out Ekaterinburg itself.
One of the things in the notebook is an illustration, a sketch, possibly a street plan.
Cook sourced a contemporary map of Ekaterinburg.
And crucially, it shows the crossroads on which the Ipatiev house was situated. Once that, or an extract of that crossroads, is superimposed on this transparency, and we overlay it onto the enlargement of Alley's notepad, we find that it's more or less a mirror image of the map. We see, for example, the Ipatiev house at the crossroads. We see the compound. Effectively, the sketch is the key to his thoughts about exiting the family potentially from that location.
By the first week in July 1918, George's Secret Service had agents in Russia, a specially built house for the Tsar, and their top agent, Stephen Alley, planning escape routes for a daring rescue. Everything was in place. The race was on to rescue the Tsar. The Russian state archives hold many documents on the Tsar's final days in Siberia, and historian Andrew Cook has found a missing piece of their tragic story in these archives, a Guard detachment record from the House of Special Purpose. As the imperial family waited in captivity, British spy Stephen Alley was planning a daring rescue Cook believes was requested by King George V. But it seems what Alley found was deeply worrying.
We know, for example, that a machine gun tower was erected on the 6th of July, which complemented other machine gun nests and other machine gun towers in the compound. We also find references to sharpshooters or marksmen, in other words, who were located at key parts of the compound.
A fortress. The House of Special Purpose would have been a major military challenge.
The first conclusion would be that such an exercise would be suicide for those British officers attempting to rescue the family, and significantly, it would also have been suicide for the family themselves.
George's desperate rescue plan never got off the ground. It was simply too little, too late.
God bless you, my dear old Nicky. And remember, you can always count on me as your friend. Ever your devoted cousin and friend, Georgie.
In spite of all George's previous letters of friendship and affection, in the end it counted for nothing. For Nicholas and his family, their fate was sealed. 16th of July 1918 would be the imperial family's last day. After over a year of house arrest, Nicholas, Alexandra, Marie, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and Alexei were shot by their captors. It was up to Lord Stamfordham to break the terrible news to King George.
He was absolutely shattered by this. He said, "Nicholas was the kindest of men. I was devoted to him, and he was a thorough gentleman." And then he started musing about these children, those beautiful daughters, and perhaps remembering them at Osborne, scampering along, by the sea, playing, and had such lovely, tender memories of them.
William responded to the news of the murder of the Russian royal family with an extraordinary coolness. It had never been a particularly close relationship, and William had a lot of other things on his mind.
The Great War was still grinding on. After 4 years of stalemate in the trenches, even William's mighty Germany was crumbling under the strain. It was an empire spiraling into chaos and anarchy.
At one point he proposed that he might perhaps lead his army back to Germany and put down the domestic unrest there. It was explained to him that the army was no longer his to lead.
William's navy was mutinying, his army collapsing, his people were turning against him.
What followed was a German revolution, which swept William, and indeed many of the other German dynasts, from their thrones.
Who bashed Bill Kaiser? I, said General Joffre. I cut his retreat right off. I bashed Bill Kaiser. Then Tommy Atkins lit a fag and said, "Law, is it over? Blighty for me." And then he jumped across the Straits of Dover when he heard of the end of poor Bill Kaiser.
As the old world crumbled around him, William packed his medals and uniforms and fled his erstwhile empire.
Well, William spent his exile in a actually rather attractive place called Huis Doorn in Holland, a nice country house, where he created a kind of Lilliputian imperial environment. And they lived a sort of bizarre life in what really felt a bit like a doll's house, a kind of symbolic residue of the old imperial monarchy.
The final months of the war saw the club disintegrate. the first 18 years of the 20th century had seen quite a culling of Queen Victoria's extended family.
Austria went, Germany went, Russia went. They were the three monarchs who really counted. And with their disappearance, the idea of monarchy as a serious element in international politics vanished.
George alone was the only of the three cousins left with a throne.
George survives, ironically, for the very reason that William often looked down on him. In other words, he was a constitutional monarch. Absolute monarchs are often vulnerable to absolute defeat. As a constitutional monarch, George survived not just because Britain was on the winning side and Germany and Russia effectively lost the war, but because a constitutional monarch is insulated, if you like, by a constitutional government.
He busies himself with his estates and his stamp albums. He's safe, he's respectable, very much a middle-class monarch, if you like. So he's not someone who, around whom a sort of miasma of revolution would collect. He's really no threat to anyone.
The Treaty of Versailles concluded the war. The statesmen who had walked at the rear of King Edward's funeral procession were now driving negotiations. Presidents, not monarchs, were the new world leaders. After millions of deaths in the war, kings and emperors were not so popular anymore.
It's very revealing, I think, that the negotiations at Versailles are, of course, run by politicians. It's really very much underlining that the power of monarchy worldwide has really evaporated.
And the truth behind King George's decision to turn down his cousin and friend in his hour of need has been kept conveniently quiet.
There is a yawning gap in the archives covering exactly that period. And over the years, royal biographers were told by the palace to always omit anything that might be a hint disagreeable or, not flattering to the royal family's image.
King George was more than happy to let the real story simply disappear.
And Lloyd George himself, when he came to write his memoirs, found that telegrams relating to the Tsar had been mysteriously removed from the files. So the whole matter was covered up, a sort of blanket of secrecy by palace mandarins, and to this day it exists. It's a painful subject at the palace.